So once again, hello and welcome everyone on the fourth session of our Scottish AI Playbook series. They're hosted by Scottish AI Alliance. My name is Maggie Jeritz. I'm the projects officer at the Scottish AI Alliance. And today we are exploring one of the incredibly fascinating areas of AI adoption, which is everything human. So we'll be talking about the human side of the equation of adoption of AI in the workplace. We're joined by an incredible guest, Luciana Blaha, assistant professor in business management and intelligent automation at Heriot-Watt University. Luciana also leads the Intelligent Automation Systems Lab at Heriot-Watt. Luciana, just before we start, I was curious to see you describe yourself as pracademic. Can you tell us a little bit about what you mean and how that impacts shows up, sort of how it shows up in your work and research?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much, Maggie. So, the concept of pracademic comes from a practical academic, and it is a little bit of a tongue in cheek term that I got stuck with from my supervisor when I was doing my PhD. Being an academic, I have done a doctorate, but I have gone into it from the industry side of things. So, prior to working in academia, I worked in the public sector. I worked for a local government. I also worked for the private sector for companies like Bosch, the Bosch Group. And so a lot of the work I did, I tended to talk about in kind of company terms. And so my supervisor actually called me a pracademic first in the sense of relating research to just the working world, industry, corporate problems, and things like that. And I felt like the shoe fit, so it
Mhm.
stuck. And so I now keep describing myself as a pracademic, so someone who puts research in practice, if you will.
Yeah, I love it. And I think especially in the area of automation AI, it's just such a great combination because obviously you have the access and you do work in the research, cutting edge research and actually figuring out what through the research what's going on. And then also you're able to translate it into business context, which is fantastic. Could you tell us a little bit more about the lab that you lead, the Intelligent Automation Lab?
Yep, certainly. So I'm really glad you brought this up, Maggie, because the lab is very much connected exactly to looking at research and context. So it's called the Intelligent Automation Systems Lab because we look at new technologies like artificial intelligence, also more established approaches to technology like automation, and sort of evolving ones like robotic in a system. So we think about them within the organizational system in the sense that companies often don't just buy a technology and it exists in a void. So, for instance, they might think about enhancing their services with AI or robotics or sort of process automation. It's usually within the context of maybe they're going through digital transformation or they're trying to redesign a particular function of their organization. So we really try to take those things into account as well.
Fantastic. Are there any specific projects that are sort of your most interesting one or one that you would like to highlight?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. So, one, I do have a soft spot for public sector, having worked in that area and seeing that the machine, if you will, needs to keep going to support society while political currents come and go, if you will. So, one of the recent projects that I will soon be involved in publishing a white paper about is related to the adoption of AI in local authorities. So, there has been a bit of research done previously. I've done this in my thesis as well before the pandemic when we were looking at more traditional forms of AI. A lot of them were related to enhancing customer service through chatbots. What we've seen after the pandemic and with the advent of large language models like GPT, Claude, and others is the fact that the way we talk about AI has changed in response to that. So, what we've looked at has been the support and sort of maturity that councils have throughout the UK now in this new context. We looked at most of the local authorities in the UK. We went over half. We didn't get the exhaustive list because some of them are merging or sort of fragmenting and renaming themselves. So they're going through major changes there, and we didn't sort of look at that because it's very specific yet. But for the UK as a whole, we're seeing indeed a tendency to need to learn more about AI to really benefit from public education about these areas and to integrate that into the local strategy. So I would say that's a high impact project that I'm working on. I am also involved in the what is called the human factors team of the transit hub. So for those of you who might not know, the Transit Hub was launched last year. It's the UK's largest investment in developing digital twinning technology for decarbonisation. AI is a part of that. So it's the idea of creating not just a simulation, but a live cybernetic or cyber physical system equivalent, if you will, of particular parts of infrastructure to help run them more efficiently to hopefully decrease carbon emissions and make them more resilient and things like that. So that is a 5-year program. We've started last year with funding from the Department for Transport, and hopefully we'll be able to have some outputs that positively impact on the UK.
That sounds amazing. A really unique project. Thanks so much. We've mentioned a couple of times already intelligent automation. And I have a feeling that, everyone kind of understands it a little bit differently.
Mhm.
Can you tell us sort of the working definition that you work with in terms of intelligent automation and how it goes beyond just a fancy RPA, basically?
Yes, definitely. And I'm really glad you pointed this out. So I did a bit of research on how the term exists, if you will, and it seems like over the past few years, we use it with different meanings that sometimes might be assumed. So, looking at consulting companies like Gartner, for example, they look at intelligent automation as a way to automate business processes from end to end. So what that means is taking, for instance, a process from the moment that the customer submits a query to the quality assurance check and then the output in terms of an invoice or a kind of response. And within that process, you might find artificial intelligence either in the form of a chatbot, if it was a large language model, or you might find machine learning if you have an algorithm that goes through a big patch of data and extracts perhaps the most likely fitting scenario to answer a question or to observe if it's about the electric grid, for example. The office that monitors that actually uses machine learning to suggest to a customer when they might get free electricity, for instance. Octopus uses that kind of information. But for other types of organizations like actual automation providers, they tend to sell it more as intelligent automation in the sense of we can do automation, which is sort of programming a task, a repetitive task at that, in order to enhance the efficiency of your processes. So it's not necessarily end to end. And then in the kind of academic view, we try to encompass the whole thing, which is you might use artificial intelligence, you might use automation. People are increasingly using it for robotics. So
Mhm.
manufacturing automation, for example, do it in a way that is intelligent so that the data is managed and there are processes, algorithms that learn, but also we kind of use it as a tongue in cheek of think about it.
Mhm.
So
I love this. Yeah.
it doesn't go against the other definitions, but we're
Mhm.
just trying to highlight that whether it's an end-to-end process or whether you're introducing robotics or whether you're automating repetitive tasks, it is within the kind of workplace.
Mhm.
So the lab really focuses on that, and that's how we try to educate about the term, just to include the other definitions, if you will, to try and reach a common understanding.
Mhm. That's fantastic. And we'll talk a little bit later about how to create those workflows and how to manage sort of those points between where humans and AI or sort of algorithms, intersect. But first of all, I wanted to ask, we talk about AI adoption, we talk about introducing intelligent automation, but obviously it's all tech. And that makes me wonder, how does AI adoption projects actually compare to other digital transformation projects? I think a lot of us, went through ERP implementations and cloud migrations and all those sort of, standard, I suppose, digital transformations. CRM rollouts can be included in that as well. When an organization is going through a major, or we're going through successfully delivered a major system upgrade and now is looking into adopting AI, what can catch them off guard? What should they expect? What are the differences?
Yeah, so I would say there are indeed a lot of similarities, and I'm glad you're pointing that out in terms of digital transformation. So, when looking at digital transformation, it's a term that has existed in business talk and academic literature and people's lived experiences for over a decade. I think perhaps we're even looking at 15, 20 years now. And we're looking at three big aspects. So one of them is indeed related to people, how people are affected. The other one is related to processes, which we've covered already in terms of processes are being redesigned. And the third one that we tend to look at is infrastructure. So we have a bit of acceleration in terms of the infrastructure element, which sometimes, even though it's included in digital transformation, we maybe don't necessarily think about it in terms of how it's changed, but more what do we need that's already in the market. With artificial intelligence, at the same time, what we've seen is a development in the supporting infrastructure that just didn't exist before. And I do think that this is one of the reasons why when artificial intelligence models were originally starting to be used in the 80s, so Google Maps, Roomba robots, character recognition on banknotes and banks, that's already part of our daily lives. Those were early machine learning and computer vision projects. We didn't have the infrastructure to support high capacity projects. What we're seeing at the moment, and in the stock market as well, is a development of new units or processors that are able to handle vastly larger amounts of data. There are also some things that might seem very sort of arcane and strange to some, called memristors and AI microchips. So these types of technologies, they're not very widespread, but what they do is they enable the processing of data very quickly with the size of much smaller, much older infrastructure, if you will. So these chips are very, very efficient. Hopefully, they will help us have less carbon emissions and address some sustainability issues that I'm sure we can talk about later. On top of that, in terms of people, I don't think many people had debates at the societal level as we're hearing at the moment in relation to ERP in terms of bias and changes in the labor market. I might be wrong, but ERP seemed to connect the various business functions together by bringing the processes in one interface that can give us different modules to monitor what's happening in the organization. Other technologies like the pocket calculator did raise questions, from teachers. Are we dumbing down our children, and what's society going to be like? So what I'm trying to highlight here in a nutshell is the fact that we have different types of innovation. Some types of innovation are incremental. We go through digital transformation and improve our processes bit by bit. Some have larger leaps in the sense of the changes that they bring on. And I think AI in this particular wave, with the advent of large language models, has created this leap in terms of our access to information, the amount of data we can process, and that affects people, policies, and infrastructure in a, I wouldn't say that it affects them more, but there's more difference in one step to the other compared to some of the other technologies. Does that answer your question?
It does, but just to maybe take a little bit further, I was also wondering about, the approach to change management and how it varies. Because obviously, in sort
Yes.
of the traditional sort of IT implementations, you would have pretty straightforward change management project, ending with sort of training and review and all that. But when you were working with a technology that constantly improves itself, especially as it becomes more and more agentic, how do you maintain, how do you manage the change? It just becomes constant, doesn't it?
Yes, yes, that's right. And then we're starting to, there was a deeper discussion about this in some papers I read, which was really enjoyable. I don't remember the authors off the top of my head, but the terms are related to cognitive load and to how technology affects that. So, to put it in simple terms, we're looking at how heavy task, tasks might feel to us and how effective we are at undertaking them. So, to put it into perspective, cognitive load increases when we are constantly interrupted, when it's new information. If we think about an employee at work, all of a sudden you're dealing with a new system. Even though you might know how it works, it takes some time to get used to it. And this would have been the same for working with SAP, with SAP, for instance. It just takes a while to get used to it, so you're a bit slower when you begin. When we look at artificial intelligence, it's constantly new, as you're pointing out. So arguably, that's a facet that creates a bit of cognitive load that increases it. On top of that, what we're finding is that you can have higher cognitive load. Things might feel a bit more difficult when you deal with very complex tasks that require you to maybe consult things. And this is the flip side that we don't often talk about. If we automate all the repetitive, boring tasks that are too easy and boring for us to do, then we're left with the more complex tasks that arguably demand a lot of us. And so this cognitive load, you can see it increasing sort of through the roof. What we're left with then is this problem of having complexity thrown at us while having an ever-changing technology as well. So the skills that are shown to work here are indeed creativity, empathy, the more human skills. I think the reason for that sometimes can be misleading because it's not just about, oh, AI can do everything else. What can we do? The idea is we actually have more complicated things to do. How do we train ourselves to be able to do that? So there are some schools of thought there in terms of using AI almost to help hold some of the weight for us in terms of using it almost as a. There was this experiment done with engineers where they had to deal with new installation manuals. And a control group had a traditional type of installation manual, sort of 300-page document, subpoints with all the installations, all the parts. The other group had the same manual, but with a model that helped them extract the information and show them the page that it took it from. That's the important bit. So it wasn't ChatGPT making things up. It was a language model that used only the manual as the training data. And in the experiment, this was measured with EKGs. So I think they were actually, they had a helmet, they were scanning what was happening in the brain. The team that used AI to retrieve the information and then use the effort to read the paragraph and think how that might be useful found it a lot less stressful than the team that had to manage things in the traditional way. So that raises two things. On the one hand, using AI to help us quickly retrieve information that we then spend more time indeed being able to navigate complex situations, but then also cultivating our flexibility in that sense to be able to question and think, what do I need to know?
Mhm.
And then using the tools that are available to us. I can talk about this a bit more if it's interesting, but I'd like to know whether that's okay and which direction you'd like to move
I
into.
think, yeah, I think it's incredibly interesting, and I think it's very much sort of in line with everything that we've talked about so far. It's interesting to see sort of this almost like a productivity paradox in terms of, AI is, yes, automating simple tasks, but also we have to learn how to use AI and and it also changes the structure of our work. So there's a lot of threads to pull here, I suppose, and discuss. But if we could focus on sort of practical information in terms of how we can help, leaders that are looking to adopt AI to support their people going through this. what would you recommend? What kind of support can help here?
Yep. So I think you touched on training a bit earlier as part of the traditional change management approach, and I think that's still valid. The type of training, however, I think would benefit from being expanded from interacting with a particular product. Let's say the company introduces a chatbot from a third party provider. How do you interact with it? To educating a bit more broadly so that people can develop that cognitive flexibility. Little plug here. I think Living with AI is a really good project from
Awesome.
the Scottish AI Alliance, and
Thank
so
you.
is the AI Playbook. The idea being that it's good to set up the context. So, in order to know what you need to ask the AI, or in order to know what might go wrong, you need to know about the type of technology you're interacting with more broadly. And I think managers can really benefit, or senior leaders can really benefit from developing the digital literacy of their employees. Now, sort of highlight or alert here, digital literacy doesn't just mean knowing how to interact with technology. JISC has a framework of, I think, 7 elements. So there are some important parts there. Digital literacy also means knowing where to go to get new information about things. It also means having communities of practice and knowledge sharing. So in your company, do you have a forum, for example, where people can ask for help, that they don't feel they need to raise an IT ticket and kind of overload the IT help desk
Mm.
when they might be experimenting with something to try and build it in a better way? There's, of course, the culture element. So that's, how do you talk to your employees about it? Do you just tell them, this is what we're going to do? It's a good business decision and it happens to them? Or the traditional discussion of, do you get employee buy-in? Do you have a consultation with your employees? Do you kind of keep them abreast of what's happening in that design process? I think one of the other aspects is indeed just general literacy, in the sense of critical thinking, of knowing how to question the output. So if you get a particular service from the technology you're adopting, can you judge whether that's good enough? So that's the digital literacy part. We've covered cognitive load a little bit, in terms of being aware of that as senior managers is very important, because a lot of times we do see artificial intelligence also being used as a bit of a marketing term of, this will make your life easier. Yes, in the long run, but in the beginning, if you have this cognitive load problem of, it's new, you don't know what you're doing, and all of a sudden you have more complex problems, basically you're firefighting all day as a result of this new technology, then you're actually not preparing for that initial difficulty of people having to adjust to this different way of working. Digital literacy, cognitive load, and the third thing was related to understanding essentially how your company will change. So if you are ready to be more creative, your processes will change as well. There is the old saying that I hear a lot of software developers say, garbage in, garbage out. The idea is, if you don't re-examine your processes and whether AI is really what you need, it could be traditional automation, or it could be just a process redesign that you need, you risk making a bad process faster.
Yeah, and that reminds me, a lot of companies, and we see this in research, don't we? That a lot of companies focus all their investments, on the majority of their investment, on technology, on developing their algorithms. However, when we look at the projects that fail, the
Mm-hmm.
majority of them fail because of people and processes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how do we, what would advice would be to the leaders to sort of, deal with this shiny object syndrome, and also cutting through the hype? Because of course, if you're buying products off the market, then the marketing promises are through the roof, on what AI can do. But how do you focus your efforts and where the real challenges lie, around people and processes? What to address there?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So there was a study done by some researchers, a team led by someone called Brunetti, in, I think this was 2021. They had a few studies, but they compared organizations that were more successful at integrating I will say intelligent automation here because it was packages of technologies when compared to others. And the ones that performed the best were the ones that had a multi stakeholder approach. So, what that means is that they weren't just buying a product and looking at how it would impact their services. They also worked with educational institutions, with non-profit institutions. So, for instance, maybe the study was done, I believe, in Italy, and there was some input from another country as well. But essentially, they had a not for profit organization that focused on technology education, much like yourselves. So the idea there was that they got multiple perspectives on how to do things, and they also worked with other organizations, so peer companies. For instance, this would translate into senior leaders going to conferences, for instance, or hearing about best practice. But importantly, it wasn't in the echo chamber where everyone was in the same role. It was about this kind of interaction with organizations that were maybe designed to think about stakeholders or society or education or healthcare in the case of more health focused organizations. The reason why that worked wasn't just because they got the multiple perspectives, but it helped snap them from thinking about the small problem of maybe the one or two large processes they were trying to deal with and questioned the strategy. So it linked the technology to the strategy. And we have had, for instance, I work with the National Robotarium quite often when we have companies visiting us to see whether robotics would be feasible for their operations. This is a problem that we see often. Robotics and technology is thought of in terms of operations and improving aspect, and it's linked to strategy from that perspective, but not necessarily in terms of the company's key strategic goals, for instance, being market leader or changing response to a particular sustainability issue or a supply chain issue, if you will.
Yeah, that's
Big rant.
amazing. That's amazing. You mentioned through this research, the stakeholders, I suppose, on a macro level, right, in terms of pure organizations and what's happening on the market. But it also made me think about, different stakeholders in terms of even just within an organization. Obviously, AI is just such a politically charged, for good reasons, topic
Mhm.
that creates a lot of different emotions and a lot of different, very often conflicting interests. You have obviously your shareholders that are looking for efficiency gains. You have your employees that are worried that their jobs will be taken away and automated. You have citizens, and we're all citizens, aren't we? They're worried about the impact of AI. You have parents that are,
Mhm.
again, worried about what's happening with their kids and future generations. And I do wonder, at what point should sort of, business leaders looking to adopt AI sort of invite all those voices, and how do they avoid, just this community, I suppose, committee voice stopping actual innovation?
That's a very good question. I think the idea is to, or my suggestion based on recent discussions would be to start to break things down into smaller chunks. So a lot of these questions are big, broad societal questions, which are great, and it's great that they're being asked. As we learn more about different types of AI technologies, what each of them can do, what their restrictions are, we are seeing, and we're seeing this a bit in the regulatory environment as well, more concrete, pragmatic steps being taken. And what I mean by this is, for instance, first of all, differentiating between different kinds of AI and regulation. Are we talking about machine learning? Are we talking about something that targets customers? Legislation, talking, classifying types of artificial intelligence in low, medium, or high impact, for instance, in the UK, in the EU AI Act. The idea is to try and speak about things in more consistent terms and then choose what to focus on. So, for instance, if you are thinking about using AI to improve your customer service, are you really thinking about a machine learning algorithm that goes through your complaints and highlights what they're related to? Are you talking about a voice assistant And within that, hopefully, as the regulation becomes more detailed, we can then start to talk almost about individual products. So I hope in a way in the future that if we have industry conferences, they might be a bit more narrow, such as AI algorithms for fraud detection con, because
Mhm.
there are flavors within that. So to filter through these big questions is trying to get through the core of it, of what are we actually talking about for my business?
Mhm.
Is this a particular family of processes that I want to apply the technology to? Because then it's easier to think about who is really impacted. From my employees, is it literally everyone in my company that will be impacted, or is it the accounting team or the IT department, and what does that mean for them? And all of a sudden, I think we're talking about more concrete terms here.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And it also, I think what you just said highlights the issue and the problem that is that a lot of people just equate AI with Gen AI, and
Yes.
that's a very narrow view of AI. And even though it's being sort of deployed, I suppose most widely, it's not the one that necessarily drives all the best impacts.
Yes.
Um, just to switch gears a little bit, but also return to something that you've mentioned earlier around culture, because I thought it was really interesting. So, it would be great if at the end of the call, our audience could go to back to their organizations and sort of do a little bit of a cultural audit and be able to answer a question, are you ready for AI? When you work with clients, what are the red flags and the green flags that help you sort of judge whether, this given organization is going to struggle with AI or actually they're ready to adopt it, they'll flourish?
Yeah. So some red flags I think you've already rightfully pointed out. The easiest red flag for me to spot is if senior leaders talk about AI and mean large language models. Because then that shows to me that they might want to do a bit more training in the area in order to be able to coordinate the project better. Another red flag would be related to the communication between senior leaders and employees. And this is more management than anything else, of strategic goals.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be, for instance, where someone on the front line is aware of what the organization wants to achieve in the next 2 years, and they understand that that is why their job might be more difficult or focused on a particular thing for a given set of time. That shows to me that there's communication. Uh, the green flags will be opposites of this, but I'm going to focus on the red flags for now. Another red flag would be related to the ability for employees to take time for training.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a particularly challenging one, I find, for public sector organizations that might be struggling with a limited budget, sometimes for political reasons, sometimes for economic reasons, or pure administrative reasons. When employees have pressure to deal with automation because otherwise they would need to reapply for their jobs or their jobs might be significantly affected, that creates a sense of distress and they're less likely to be positive about the process. So the green flags really, and the final red flag that's very obvious is about communication. How consistent is the communication? Does it appear on an internal forum? Is it just a post on LinkedIn from a senior leader? You kind of see where I'm going to here.
Mm-hmm.
It's that kind of multi-stakeholder education, digital literacy approach.
Mm-hmm.
The green flags are related to building a culture of experimentation. So sometimes learning about these things doesn't need to be driven from by the senior leaders. You can find situations, and I've seen situations where tools are given to employees that they can experiment with small automation themselves. So a really nice one, for instance, with a vendor that everyone knows about, Microsoft, is when employees had the opportunity to automate their emails. So every time I get this post from a colleague in a different department, I'm going to get an email. interestingly, in research, even though this wasn't artificial intelligence, it was automation, these employees were less afraid of
Mhm.
artificial intelligence projects or products. So the idea was to have that kind of safe environment experimentation in a place that everyone felt, yes, I could see how this simple task could contribute to my day. That kind of empowerment of employees I found was a major green flag. Another green flag in terms of culture is related to what culture consists of. So it's a combination of communication, artifacts of behaviors over time. So if leaders say, okay, we want to encourage our employees to learn about AI, and then they start organizing little events or they post little things consistently, and that can be traced, it's an existing source of knowledge or an existing document, people can start to build that in the company. So that's a very positive thing. And lastly, it's related to that kind of listening ear. When you see employees from the company, maybe they're mid managers, they often get disregarded. They're allowed to communicate with other organizations. Maybe they have an associate membership of a chartered institute or something like that. If they have that and they're allowed to bring it in to the organization, that can only contribute. So it's really about having that participation, allowing people to be involved in the process, not just kind of asking for their opinion, but allowing people in the organization at all levels to perhaps even surprise senior leadership with their creativity and their capacity to use technology.
Mhm. So what I'm hearing there, there's sort of a huge aspect of creating an environment that's psychologically safe to
Yes.
experiment, to be curious, to make mistakes, to fail.
Yes.
And also, I was intrigued by this research you mentioned around sort of automating your emails that, that helped with people sort of trusting or being less fearful of the technology itself. But then I suppose that that leads me to another question around trust, because obviously, in order for people to maybe conquer some of those fears, they need to trust technology a little bit more, become more accustomed to it, rely on it a little bit more. But on the other hand, we do know that it's not a foolproof technology. We know
Yes.
that, it's prone to mistakes. They're often difficult to find. What's the sweet spot, I suppose? How do we keep the balance of sort of healthy skepticism towards the technology at the same time, you know, empowering people and sort of, supporting the adoption of AI?
That's a powerful question. I think the answer in it lies in answering the question, what happens when the computer says no? So
Mm,
it's sort of remembering the responsibility and the contribution that people have. Also, adoption isn't uniform. It's not cohesive in an organization. You will always have people that are skeptical, or something in particular hasn't been resolved that bothers them. And until that is resolved, they won't feel positive or safe enough. So the sweet spot is about that context. I really feel that it's about finding that context where, yes, you enable people's work through technology, but you also give them the chance to figure out how that fits into their life. And there's some variation in how that happens. So I would say the sweet spot isn't the same for everyone. That being said, there are a few kind of typologies that you hear about. So you have the idealists, you have people who are very pragmatic, you have people who overestimate technology, and people who see it in a very negative light. So if you can work with those variations will be sort of, I wouldn't necessarily say predictable, but at least you have a direction. I would say there are four sweet spots for
mhm.
each typology, if you will, as far as I've seen roughly in my work.
And I suppose this, recognizing that would also then inform the way that you communicate, and train those different groups, because there are different things that you
Mhm.
have to address with them and different benefits that would convince them, I suppose.
Yes, yes, that's right. I liked the sentence that someone said recently, which was problems in the organization weren't problems that people had, they were problems for people. So the idea was about solving those problems
Mhm.
for people in order to enable them to do their work, because people generally want to do their work.
Amazing. Before we move on to the questions from our audience, one final question I wanted to ask you is about, and it's by no means a small question, I appreciate it, but it's about designing the workflows and basically, you know, how do we build the workflows where that involve both human employees and AI employees? Doesn't sound right, but you know what I mean. Where the cooperation actually goes smoothly. So, what are the friction points and how can they be addressed so that, those new processes that incorporate both of those elements, the human and the AI, actually deliver, or if there's the biggest chance of them delivering quality sort of impact, high
I
quality
think
output.
you've, yeah, I think that's a very good question. The answer, in my view, is on a case by case basis of somewhat going through the steps you've just described in terms of identifying what are the pain points with the process, what is repetitive. So, generally, in order for an automation to work, you need a process that is repetitive because, especially if it's traditional automation or robotic process automation, it needs some given parameters that it then just executes. And the human needs to be able to deal with all the chaos that inevitably happens. So there's an element of maintenance, having a maintenance team in place, an element of quality assurance, where you have quality assurance, an element of still task execution. So if I'm thinking, for instance, of a contact center worker, they probably will benefit from getting maybe a transcript of the call to be able to write their report, so that they can maybe discuss it with their manager, or they can make a note on someone's case. Same for account managers. So the idea there is going back to thinking about it in terms of data a little bit. Where does it get stuck? Do we need to make it more available to someone? What is the problem here? And I like that, going back to that explanation with the engineers, because in a way you could say you could just hire a robot and an AI to diagnose what the problem is, and then the robot executes. But that engineer also knows about the nuances of how quickly the machine would break, what their client needs, the order in which tasks need to be executed. And believe it or not, technology breaks and it's very
Mhm.
expensive. So you might actually find that humans are cheaper and more reliable. Don't think, I didn't imagine I would say that,
Yeah.
but humans are cheaper and more reliable, and they're very capable. Often, even with the robotarium, when we look at some of the prices for robotics and what they can actually do compared to a human, you would need to hire maybe six or seven. You can hire 6 or 7 humans, and they will do a much better job for the
Mhm.
same price. Um, so it's kind of going back to that realism about
Yeah.
technology a little bit, I think, thinking about what the
Yeah.
problem actually is. And
Start with the problem, absolutely, not
yeah,
rather with a solution.
yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much. Let's move on to the questions from the audience. Thank you so much for all of you for already submitted your questions, and feel free to keep them coming. The first one we have from Sid is, do we see that AI would evolve and reduce the cognitive load over a period of the time, or do we see that it would improve productivity and job satisfaction?
Well, so interesting question. In a way, if the cognitive load is reduced for humans, arguably the job satisfaction would increase. A leading cause of burnout is when the feeling of constantly firefighting, like you have to deal with ever changing complex problems. So being able to have a decrease in that, I think, would contribute to job satisfaction a little bit. Productivity is related to that. Although I do think that the way in which we think about productivity may change over time.
Mhm.
So there was this study and the discussion about cognitive load. And one of the papers I was reading, maybe next time I'll prepare a set of papers so I can tell you the authors and you can read it yourself. Apologies, I don't know it off the top of my head, but the
Feel
idea
free to
was,
share. feel free to share it with us later and I'll attach it to the notes for the show for
Perfect.
audience.
I might, because it was a very interesting one. The discussion was that we often, or companies might be tempted to still think, and economically, we think about productivity in terms of how can we produce more for less money?
Mhm.
And how can we keep doing that? And part of the discussion is if we think about how we allocate our brain budget, if you will, in terms of cognitive load, how can we produce things that better address our needs that may be, more expensive to begin with, but long term have a higher impact? So that productivity discussion, I think, can change over time as we use technologies like AI to change our ability to produce, if you will. Okay.
Great. And the next question from Kevin. If I'm understanding correctly, it seems like the cognitive load increase is particularly important to be aware of around employees who could be susceptible to neurodivergent burnout. Taking away the less complex tasks too much could bring it around much more quickly.
Kevin, yes.
It's more of a statement than a question, but yes.
Yes, I agree with that statement. Sadly, I am not specialized in neurodivergent cognitive structures. I wish I was, but from discussions with friends and seeing what's happening around me with colleagues and my own experience, indeed, having a way to realize what's happening, that the changing complexity of tasks could actually bring on a risk, is really important. So indeed, taking away complex tasks too much could bring burnout around more quickly is entirely possible. So can we maybe have less complex tasks that are not repetitive? For instance, having regular knowledge exchange
Mhm.
sessions with colleagues, or even just having a regular kind of communication that contributes to the culture or the work in a different way than sending invoices or payroll. So
Yeah,
simple tasks have their place. I think that's what we're agreeing on in the
absolutely.
workplace.
But also in terms of just giving us a little bit of a break, doesn't it, for our brain
Yes,
just to
exactly.
wander and sort of, the greatest innovations come from boredom, I suppose.
Yes,
Um,
exactly.
Amazing. Okay, next question. What role could AI play in the public sector as a catalyst for inclusive urban futures? Oh, that's really interesting. Where missing data and biased records are not failures, but powerful signals that reveal hidden needs, inform more ethical governance, and unlock bold strategies for sustainable city making. What a great
I it,
question.
it it feels like a veiled question that is also a suggestion.
Yes.
I do like the approach where we're looking at missing data not as a failure but as
Mm,
an insight. So I completely agree with anonymous attendee on this point. In terms of AI, what we see in the digital twin project is that indeed what we can do is find let's see, this is a project in development, so I need to be careful how I word things here. But we can use the creative capabilities of AI to help us find what's missing. Um, if we have, for instance, interfaces in urban planning software that help us explore what's there, but also ask, okay, what hasn't been included? Can we think of a case? Maybe we can scan through the news or think about something we've read that tells us of a problem we haven't tackled. So I to be brief on that one, I think it can help on the creativity side of things. Synthetic data is a possibility
mhm.
with AI. If we have missing data, to explore potential alternative simulations that might help us tackle needs that normally we don't look at. So, good suggestion question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the next question is in a very similar vein. How can urban governments harness AI to better understand the hidden dynamics of local economies, where traditional policy levers are weak, and use those insights to anticipate change, empower communities, and guide more equitable and sustainable economic transformation?
Yeah, no, so I think that kind of data creation, data exploration is one of them. I also think there's a lot to think about in terms of, again, thinking in very concrete terms. Can we gamify questions? Can we make them more accessible so that we can gather data more effectively from the local economy, and then indeed use those to look at the questions we're asking? But I think we've covered quite a lot of it indeed in terms of anticipating change. That's the answer from the previous question. In terms of empowering communities, is using the approachability of AI to gather data differently and to allow people to have more input. So again, what comes to mind is actually AI systems in a context. So if you have an AI algorithm, you could have a sentiment analysis algorithm that you put in an interface that a community can contribute to. So it's how do you pair the building blocks to have more approachable technology?
Absolutely. So I suppose if we maybe could go back a little bit from a sort of, urban government context to a workplace context. A lot of the things that we talked about, change management, training, culture, that all of those sort of areas, I suppose, are within the merit of not just leadership, but also very often predominantly the HR team.
Mm-hmm.
So the question I wanted to ask is, how do you foresee HR teams changing and sort of taking on this new relationship, given also not just in terms of adoption for HR processes, within recruitment, for example, or even performance review, but, supporting the leadership and actually making sure the adoption is successful.
I'm glad that you mentioned processes like the recruitment aspect of things, and the sort of administrative aspect of things, such as payroll, for instance. And I think those are established and they're developing. There are bias questions, the interviewing through AI and CV screening is a discussion for another day. I want to bring something that I haven't heard of being talked about very often, which is related to the wider discussion of the more delicate matters that HR intervenes in. So HR departments often also have to deal with disciplinaries. They have to deal with training and succession planning. And that is the area where indeed discrete communication, discernment, being able to think about the ethical implications is really important. So apart from being technologically enabled in a productivity sense, I see HR teams changing in terms of having to tackle some of these wider ethics questions of, in this particular session, for instance, if an algorithm mistreats someone or causes indirect harm to someone in the company, but a human was involved in the process, someone from the front line or an accountant, where do we draw the boundaries between our employees and technological responsibility? And how do we ensure that the communication is fair, that there's due diligence, accountability, transparency? So I really think that the HR profession, apart from becoming more efficient, can really help um, tackle some of these challenges that are brought on by the new types of technologies we're working with.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I suppose also inform policies within the organizations and the
Yes.
strategy. Sounds like it's
Yes.
just such an important stakeholder to have at your table.
Yes, no, absolutely. Because it's, I do feel like, well, there's this old business management model from the 80s. Some of you may have heard of it, called the value chain. And HR was a support function, but that doesn't mean it's a secondary function. It means it connects different aspects together. So HR can really look at what the impact of the technology is and then help, as exactly as you're saying, shape the policies around us. For us, human factors in digital twinning, if you will, is similar to HR in the sense of we need to negotiate which humans we're looking at and how we represent them in the system when we include AI and similar technologies, but also think about how can people interact with this technology effectively so that we can gather data to give them a better service.
Amazing. Okay, and unfortunately, we're running out of time, but there is one question I ask all of my guests, which is, what is it that you're most excited about in terms of, how the AI is moving forward?
Ooh, I'm excited about more explainable AI that can reliably tell you how it arrived at a conclusion. And this is not something that exists in large language models. Large language models, as they are, and possibly as I see it for the foreseeable future, can't provide that. So there are some new approaches out there that are more reliably explainable. So I'm looking forward to that.
I think that would go a long way in building trust in a workplace and beyond in a
Yeah.
society towards AI.
Yes.
Amazing. Well, Luciana, thank you so much for this fantastic conversation. I really appreciate all of your inputs, and thank you to all of those that asked their questions. Just as a reminder, we're recording this and we'll release the recording soon. If you're interested in joining us for future events or would like to see a recording of the past events, please do visit the Scottish AI Playbook website and it's all there. And that's all for us for today. Thank you so much for joining again. Thank you, Luciana, for the conversation and take care. We'll be in touch. Bye bye.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Bye.